Stockholm Syndrome, also known as Survival Identification Syndrome, is defined as a group of psychological symptoms that occur in some people who are victims in a hostage situation. This syndrome has everything to do with how one copes after a traumatic situation. Did you know that there are several victims who can identify with Stockholm Syndrome, since this psychological phenomenon has been around since the 1970s? Stockholm Syndrome is a condition very real that has impacted many lives that have fallen victim to kidnapping and other instances where a person was kept against their will. Oftentimes, the friends and families of the victims fail to comprehend why their loved one seems to have sympathy or compassion toward their abusers. This syndrome can be considered a form of bonding between a captive and captor, in which the captive begins to sympathize and understand their captor. There are several components that factor into whether or not a person will develop Stockholm Syndrome after being held captive, and there is no way to know until after the captivity is done. Patricia Hearst was the first major case of Stockholm Syndrome in the United States in the 1970s. Elizabeth Smart is another nationwide case of Stockholm Syndrome, but sheds a different view of how the syndrome was viewed in previous cases. First, we are going to look at some background history of Stockholm Syndrome so we can get a better understanding of what it is and how people cope with moving forward with their lives. A complex reaction to a frightening situation is a component of Stockholm Syndrome. Experts who research this syndrome are studied from actual hostage situations such as World War II concentration camps, religious cults, battered wives, incest survivors, abused children, and also persons taken hostage. According to medicaldictionary.com, Stockholm Syndrome was named when a bank robber in Stockholm, Sweden in 1973 took 4 employees of the bank into the vault and held them captive for over 5 days. When the captor finally released his detainees, they seemed to have formed an emotional bond with their captor. They seemed to have a more negative feeling towards the police and a more positive feeling toward their captor. Niels Bohr was a medical professor at the time of the robbery and served as a psychiatric consult during the hostage negotiation. It was Bohr who gave the condition its name, and there are 3 main characteristics of this syndrome. First, hostages have negative feelings towards police or other authority figures. Secondly, hostages have positive feelings towards their captors. And thirdly, the captors develop positive feelings toward their hostage. It is important to note that not all people who are taken hostage are going to show signs or symptoms of Stockholm Syndrome. Now we are going to take a look at one of the first cases in the United States in which we associate Stockholm Syndrome. FBI.gov states that Patricia Hearst was kidnapped from her apartment in Berkeley, California in February of 1974. She was 19 and a college student when she answered the knocks on her door to find a group of armed men and women. The angry mom of people beat her fiancé and then threw her in the trunk of a car and took off. It turns out Patty was kidnapped by a group of people who called themselves the Symbionese Liberation Army, also known as the SLA, who was led by a criminal by the name of Donald DeFries. The purpose of the kidnapping was to instigate a guerrilla war against the United States government to destroy the capitalist state. Hearst was a wealthy heiress to her grandfather's newspaper empire. The SLA succeeded at getting the nation's attention. The SLA soon began demanding ransom-type requests in exchange for Patty's release. It was at this time that the SLA began brainwashing and abusing Hearst in hopes to send her back as a threat of what was to come. They were also successful in turning Patty. The SLA released an audio tape on April 3rd of Patty saying she was joining the SLA task force. 12 days later, Hearst was spotted on bank surveillance in tow with an assault rifle during an SLA bank robbery. The FBI finally caught a break on May 16th, where law enforcement was led to the SLA safe house. A massive shootout ensued. But much to their surprise, Hearst was nowhere to be found. She had escaped and was traveling around the country to avoid arrest. Her luck finally ran out on September 18, 1975, when she was finally captured in San Francisco. During her trial, she used a brainwashing defense but was still found guilty. She was sentenced to 7 years in prison, but her sentence was later pardoned by President Bill Clinton. Another well-known case of Stockholm Syndrome most of us have heard of today. This is the case of Elizabeth Smart. Let's take a moment to take a look at a photo of Elizabeth. Elizabeth Smart was 14 years old when she was abducted by knife point from her Utah home bedroom on June 4, 2002. Brian David Mitchell and his wife Wanda Barzee hid Elizabeth away at the base of the Wasatch Mountains. It was in the grove of the mountain oaks where she was held against her will for 9 months, being raped every day. There were several instances, though, through her ordeal that she could have told someone who she was, but she chose not to. In an interview she did with The New Yorker, Smart insists this was for her deep fear, and it is what has kept her from alerting authorities. Elizabeth believes that her component of Stockholm Syndrome wasn't having positive feelings towards her captor, but her lack of self-worth and complete and total fear. Fear is what kept her compliant with her captors. In a positive light, Stockholm Syndrome has a good chance of recovery. Obviously, several factors play into one's success or demise of a positive recovery. These factors include length of time of being in captivity, the nature of the situation, and the individual's ability to cope with previous trauma. Again, we took a look at the history of where Stockholm Syndrome first originated and also the infamous cases of Patricia Hearst and Elizabeth Smart. Overall, Stockholm Syndrome is something not a lot of people fully understand. If they have never been in a hostage situation, it is hard for others to comprehend feeling a connection to someone who has done so much harm to them. If we all understand Stockholm Syndrome, we might be able to help someone we love cope with a tragedy someday.